Hey, good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming along to the first of our sessions on overcoming challenges in biodiversity modelling, data mechanisms, scale, and model intercomparisons. Just some quick housekeeping. The translation code is just, you can't hear? Is that better? Okay, we'll be, yeah. So quick housekeeping, the translation code is just outside of the door if you need those services. My name's Natalie Briscoe. I'll be giving you the first kind of introductory talk to this session, as well as covering a little bit of research if I can squeeze it in. I just want to acknowledge my co-organisers, Damaris, Mark, Santiago, and Greta. So I think that all of us in this room would agree that we need model biodiversity models to understand current biodiversity patterns and predict how these patterns are likely to change in the future. I'd also argue that we need more models that incorporate the underlying mechanisms driving these patterns, both so we can identify management levers or quantify impacts of different decisions, and because once we know these mechanisms, we should be able to more reliably predict how things might change in the future. So this symposium really came out of a working group that I'm part of through GeoBond, the EcoCode working group led by Mark, Greta, Damaris and Santi. And this is really focusing on modelling to support GeoBond's mission and particularly trying to have an international kind of push to project future changes in biodiversity in response to environmental changes. So we're really focusing here and in this second session on predictive biodiversity models. So we have lots of great monitoring data, well, some of it great, in indicators to look back at where we've been, but what we really need to do is chart our way forwards to achieve our goals. So this is a paper that just came out in PNAS led by Damaris, really making the case for perhaps the overlooked role of predictive models in the global biodiversity framework. So we need these for two reasons. One is to evaluate whether our current actions or commitments are actually going to get us where we want to go, our desired outcomes. And the other is to identify and chart a course. How do we actually get there? What set of actions will deliver those outcomes? So if you're interested in this, we have a fireside chat to discuss this more on Friday at 2 p.m. But we need these biodiversity models. We have a lot of challenges to overcome if we're going to apply them. So the first one we've heard a lot about in this conference relates to data. So we know that our biodiversity data are often patchy and biased. We have imperfect detection. We also have challenges when it comes to environmental data. So things are rapidly improving, but we don't always have these at the scale or resolution that we need. And we're also still trying to work out, I think, exactly what the most relevant drivers are. When it comes to models that incorporate mechanisms, we have questions like which mechanisms, which models can best incorporate this, and how does this vary across different groups or across environments or with different levels of data availability. And finally, another thing we've heard a lot about at this conference is scale and computational constraints. So a lot of these models are very intensive. We have challenges integrating across spatial scales, so going from regional to global models, thinking about different biological levels, and also kind of scaling up wider use of these approaches, making them more accessible. Overall, we just want to know, are we providing useful outputs that can inform decisions? And so it's really exciting. Across these two sessions, we're going to have such a great range of talks addressing a lot of these different challenges. I'm not going to flag all of them, but just highlight a few topics we're going to cover. So trait databases, integrated models, and deep learning to address kind of data challenges. Ways forward to better account for weather extremes and climate variability. Techniques for being able to apply these models like emulators across much more relevant spatial scales. Models that can capture demographic responses or species interactions, attribution studies so we can work out which drivers are the most important, and studies highlighting, I guess, providing ways we can have better access to software and computational resources. As well as some really great kind of examples of applying these models and evaluating them and using them to do useful things. So we have another session tomorrow, Thursday at 10:45, a couple of posters and the fireside chat. So there's a lot going on. So in the remaining time that I have left, I just wanted to touch on some of my own research that relates to this topic of models that incorporate mechanisms and how we can evaluate and compare them. So one option would be to use real case studies. This is really great because they're realistic, but we do have some challenges because, as we've heard, the data we have is not perfect. And so the actual truth can be uncertain. Another option is to use simulation studies. Here we know the truth, we have a lot of control, but often these are can be unrealistically simple. And so I think these are quite complementary approaches, but in this particular study, we were trying to develop a simulation system that could kind of realistically capture the complex way that animals respond to their environments and test different models using this data. So we were interested in species range dynamics. So I started with a species that I know well, the koala, and we used a physiological based model of individual koalas. I'm just going to brush over the detail here, but essentially what this model is doing is taking daily weather data, downscaling this to microclimate data, and then using information about the species traits and the principles of biophysics to calculate how much energy or water that koala requires when it's in a particular location, and doing this through time. So we can couple this with information about energy and water available in the environment from its food and rainfall, to calculate whether it's likely to be able to survive, so maintain its energy and water balance, and also whether it could, for females, if we include the cost of lactation, if they could reproduce. And you can see this model actually does a great job of capturing the range limits of this species. The black dots are the occurrence data. But at a local scale, there are other things going on. So we integrated this model with an individual-based model. So here we have koalas across the landscape. Whether they reproduce is driven by the outputs of that. Probabilities are driven by the outputs of the physiological-based model. They can disperse and set up their own home ranges. Size of these depends on habitat quality. And we also bring in other things such as fire, which causes mortality and changes the quality of the habitat. We run these simulations across a real landscape in Eastern Australia, which is quite fragmented. And unfortunately, when we run it with realistic settings, we see a very sharp population decline. And this mirrors what we've observed from survey data in this region. In our simulation system, each of those kind of pink areas is a koala home range. We're tracking their age, their reproductive output, and their movement through time. But for our model fitting, we need to simulate sampling. And we do this using a fixed budget. The reason that's important is because we're testing out different sorts of models, and all of these models have different types of inputs. So this is from a paper I led where we tried to classify kind of different process explicit models based on their inputs, outputs, and how they link to the environment. This is not an exhaustive classification, but you can see, say, over at the more simple end, you have occupancy dynamics models where you have occurrence data and you're estimating probabilities of colonization and extinction, and to simulate occupancy dynamics through time. You also have, at the other end of the spectrum, models that use demographic data only. So here we have field demographic data, and we're combining this with trade information to predict vital rates and population growth rates across space. In the middle, you can have a combination of the two. We call these coupled SDM population models, often also called hybrid models. So here you're combining occurrence data, which is used to kind of map habitat and constrain carrying capacity, with an underlying population model. The main thing is the input data differs. And so we were trying to compare across these different models and compare them to more conventional correlative species distribution models. We fit each of these in a range of ways. I don't have time to go into it, but we implemented them different ways that we had seen in the literature. This gives an example of what the sampling looks like. So you have a fixed budget. So when you have only occurrence data from a single year across a study period, you can sample many sites. But when you get to the other end, the blue dots are the demographic data. You're tracking individuals over time. And so you can sample from fewer sites. I showed you that original scenario before. This just shows the simulated output, so year 1 and year 20, as well as the trajectory. But we can create kind of different scenarios by altering vital rates, the initial distribution across the study region, and dispersal, as well as the drivers included in the model. So we can toggle them on or off. Do we have fire? Do we have weather? We use the first 5 years for training the models and then the last 10 for testing, and we run 25 replicates of each, so redoing sampling and model fitting. I'm just going to show you a couple of quick preliminary results, but if we look at the spatial performance using AUC across the test years, this is just for that first scenario. You can see that all the models do quite well except for the demographic distribution models. And I should acknowledge, A, that these were fit in quite a simple way, but also that this is maybe not surprising because they have no information from where the species does not occur. If you look across the scenarios, in general, the occupancy dynamic models do the best, followed by the SDMs. We think about an actual application that we might use this for, identifying the top sites to protect. Here we looked at the relative to an optimal solution, if we knew exactly where the animals were, what proportion of the population would we protect if we selected the top 5% ranked sites at the end of, say, at year 20. And this really varies across the scenarios. Sometimes the models do quite well, about 80%, other times very poorly. And what was worrying perhaps is when you see these really steep declines, none of the models are doing a good job of picking up where those individuals will persist. We can also predict temporal trends in abundance. Obviously, not all of these methods predict abundance. So in some cases, we're using as a proxy changes in area of occupancy, and whether that is a good idea or not. People do it. So we looked at it. So here we have the standardized kind of population size. So 1 means no change over time, which is what the correlative species distribution models are predicting in this case. But of course, we see that very large decline, which is captured by some of the other models. But again, if we look across the scenarios, it's a pretty mixed picture. So none of the models are really doing a great job across all of the different scenarios. Again, thinking about how we might apply this, looking at informing evaluations of extinction risk, do we even put it in the right category based on the extent of a decline? So here you can see based on the IUCN categories, we should be in this most at risk category, and the coupled SDM population models mostly get this, but for the others, they overestimate it and the SDMs completely miss it. For a totally different scenario where the population is increasing, the models really underpredict this. They mostly get the category right, that we shouldn't be worried, but again, some don't. So insights from this so far. Good AUC in spatial predictions does not mean that you can predict population trends. So far, if I had to pick a model, I'd say the occupancy dynamic models appear a bit more reliable. They don't always get it perfectly right, but they tend to go less wrong. At the things we've looked at so far. Predictions from the coupled SDM population models are really sensitive to how you implement them and how they're set up. And I think there's more we could do to parameterize these particular models in a better way with calibration. And the demographic distribution models and these coupled models are quite variable across replicates, depending on where you sample. And so if you really only have a little bit of data, you could get quite different predictions depending on where that happens to come from. And a final kind of call that I think these sorts of studies are really useful and we could do better, and we need more biodiversity model intercomparison projects. So this is from another lovely paper led by Damaris, and it's just kind of making the point that, climate scientists have been doing this for a long time, comparing models against standardized benchmark data and looking at uncertainty in projections. And efforts in the biodiversity space are pretty recent, but I think that these approaches could give us a lot of information to improve our models. Just want to thank my co-authors, particularly Guru, Jane and Rob, who were involved in that model evaluation study, and highlight a couple of EcoCode opportunities that we have. We have a survey in terms of looking at training needs for biodiversity modelling, and we really would love feedback, particularly from those from South America, but others are welcome to fill it out as well. There's an opportunity to submit abstracts for the World Biodiversity Forum, and don't forget the fireside chat and our session tomorrow. Thank you. Do we have time? 2 minutes? Okay, maybe one quick question. Yeah.
I am pretty curious. I know the challenges to validate all these models with scarce data and the lack of temporal information, but I'm really curious to know how did you assess the reliability of the models?
So we use a whole range of different metrics to look at model predictive performance. So some of them are more focused on how well they predict in space and some in time. So I'm just focusing on the overall regional trends. And yeah, so we use different metrics but it is a challenge because I think those different aspects, it's hard to find, well, if anyone has ideas, a single metric that captures all of those components that we want in a model. So we tended to think more about how people would apply them and how well they did at those tasks. Yeah, which I think is useful. Cool. Okay, that's okay. We can move on. Thank you. So next up, we have Dirk Karger, and he will be talking about more than heat, mapping climatic constraints on global biodiversity. Thank you.
Yeah, it's better. Okay. Hello, everyone. So I would like to start you off with a question. So what drives global biodiversity change? Of course, many of you will know some of the answers to that. First of all, we have climate change, and there it's really depends on what aspect of climate is actually driving a change. Is it just temperature? Is it changes in precipitation or moisture availability? And then still the major driver we have right now of changes in biodiversity is land use change. And here it's the habitat availability. So disentangling those is already one big question, but the next one would be what actually happens if our land use changes and all of those are adapted to climate change. So this is the last question I want to address here. We're doing so by just looking at land use change as one aspect and also climate change as another. So how does changes in land use or changes in climate change the availability for species to thrive? And we just combine those together. And we're doing so by using species data from IUCN range maps or BirdLife, and those we use in a species distribution modeling framework for mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. And we build an ensemble, and this ensemble builds the basis for the intersectional impact model intercomparison project. So for the biodiversity sector in there, so we have an ensemble of 3 different SDM algorithms and different time steps. We use a standard resolution of 0.5 degree globally with 3 emission pathways and socioeconomic scenarios, and then additional different kind of SDMs to also address the climate sensitivity. As predictors, we do not use the direct climate data we get out of the models. We use bioclimatic variables, which we refined a while ago into more meaningful variables than just these usual 19 bioclims, which were commonly used before. Some of them are really derived, like moisture availability, for example, relative humidity is in there, temperature, precipitation, and their seasonalities, and site water balance, for example, which is kind of a nice predictor when it goes to energy availability from water in that sense. So it accumulates water deficits over long time periods, and we not having this only at 0.5 degree resolution, but also at a kilometer scale actually available. And from that, for each of the species, we actually select those kind of climate variables which are important, and not important because they're correlating with the range, but they're predicting the range. So we're using an exhaustive sampling for that, using all combinations of possible climatic variables, and then predict and check how well does this predict. And from that really run then a selection of the climate variables which best predict the species ranges globally. And well, the models perform differently. Of course, some of them are, these ones are actually GLMs here. They perform relatively well. Random forest as well. It's our gums not. This is just a small subsampling actually for mammals here. And they perform differently depending on what is the range size of the species. So actually, mid-range species get predicted well. Global species with a large range in this framework are not well predicted, for example. This is how it looks like, and where you can see a little bit the cost resolution as well of the entire thing. So of course it has its limitations from that, but we're just predicting in this framework only the environmental suitability, but not the actual ranges. When we look then into what climate variables are actually the most important ones for changes, so that means how strong are they explaining or predicting the range of the species versus how strong are they changing into the future, then we see that. But as soon as we go into the tropics, temperature seasonality is much more important and changes in there for the species range dynamics in the future. And so is air humidity, for example. And in dry areas, it's really precipitation, which is limiting. So we can disentangle a little bit which are the climate variables and which are the important ones for future change with this framework. Now, when it comes to the land use, which is another important aspect, then we are checking two different kinds of assumptions. One is that we're using an adaptive pathway so that land use and changes in habitat availability are actually adapted to climate changes. And I give you a little bit more information about that later, what this actually means, or a non-adaptive pathway, which means we're doing nothing, we're just keeping it how it is today. All of these are aligned with the usual socio-economic pathways we have in CMIP, for example. And to get to these adaptive pathways, we're using an integrative assessment model, which is built on different kind of climate change impact models, which are available in the ECMIP framework. And there it's really that you check when climate change happens, what happens to different sectors, agricultural productivity, and how can we adapt to that, or energy availability, crop production, and so on, everything which actually influences land use changes and land cover changes. And those ones are then harmonized with the current land cover data, and we get an adaptive framework when we're really putting some effort into mitigating the change, the effects of climate change. So this is all work which has been done by my master's student Fabienne over the last year. So she has been bringing together this information from ECMIP with the species distribution models which we were using, and has been analyzing that. So we're using a really simple framework by just masking the habitat information, which is available in the habitat classification scheme of IUCN, together with the land use data, and then get a weighted probability of species occurrences in our half-a-degree grid cells. And well, I'm just changing it to this. And this is actually how that would look like. At the macroclimatic suitable scale, we see these large overpredictions of species richness, simply because they're suitable, where we haven't taken in any kind of habitat constraints. This is including the habitat constraints. And then on this side here, we see the differences in that. So the filtering afterwards gets actually much closer also to the observed species richness after we've taken habitat constraints into account. Now I have to go back to this. And when we look then at changes in adaptive and non-adaptive pathways when it comes to habitat availability or natural or croplands in this case, and see that at least in adaptive pathways, we have more room for natural vegetation. This has to do with an increasing crop productivity, CO2 fertilization, and adaptation of the crop systems to warmer temperatures and different water availability. And that's why we have decreases across all scenarios, for example, for croplands, if we adapt to climate change. And when we look then, how does it play out with species richness, for example? Then in the mid-century, for adaptive scenario versus a non-adaptive scenario in non-emission pathway like SSP 126, we have hardly any differences between our mitigation or non-adaptation and adaptation scenarios when it comes to species richness, but it starts to play out at the end of the century already. There we have a bunch of species which we would kind of save in that sense by the adaptation to climate change. And this effect gets stronger the more stronger climate change gets practically, and the longer the time frame. So the largest differences we have under the worst scenarios in this case, which would be down here. So under SSP 585, we have up to 60 species, 70 species, which are different from what we would see if we have a non-adaptive scenario to climate change. So what does it actually mean then in numbers of not just differences in species richness, but when we look at the species richness itself? So under a non-adaptive pathway, these are the changes towards a reference period. So how much species do we lose towards today? And by today, I mean 1981 to 2010. So there's lots of differences in the tropics, a large loss of climate suitability plus land use changes, which lead to this up to 300 species decline. And in the adaptive versus non-adaptive way, we have, which I showed earlier already, this is for the high emission pathways, we have actually a reduction of this. But if you put that on top, we still have species loss, even under a mitigation scenario where we adapt to climate change with our line cover, and this is particularly pronounced in the tropics. So what does it mean at the end? Adaptation can mitigate, but it cannot prevent changes in biodiversity towards the negative side. So we can do something about it, but it's like hitting the brakes when we slam into a wall, but we just slam into it with like 50 kilometers instead of 100 practically. But it helps already a bit. So, and with that, I'm done. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. We have time for a couple of questions. They're just up the back. And we'll just bring a microphone to you so that the people on Zoom can hear.
All right, thank you for the talk. I have a very quick question, actually. Climate models are famous for being bad at the tropics because they are built based on the global north most of the time. Can this be influencing your extreme results on the tropics?
You mean the climate models itself?
Yes.
I'm not entirely sure if they're bad in the tropics to start with, but that's why we're using an ensemble of different climate models. So, and this ensemble is usually spread over a specific range of climate sensitivities, going from models with low climate sensitivity to those with a very high climate sensitivity, UKASM, for example, to take care of these uncertainties we have, at least from the climate modeling side, if that answers your question. So there is an effect there, and there's uncertainty, of course, but I don't think it's across the board.
Maybe one very quick question. If anyone has it?
Thank you. This is very insightful. I have a very straightforward question. Not sure how far you can go with the answer, but if adaptation cannot prevent biodiversity loss based on your results, what do you think can?
stepping away from fossil fuels might be the first step, and then not chopping down the forest and poisoning the environment is the next one. That can.
Great answer. Thank you. Please thank her. Hey, next up we have Justin Travis, who's going to be talking about from complex models to scalable forecasts, emulators in the age of living data.
Yes, good morning, everybody. And thanks to Nat and the rest of the EcoCode leadership team for putting on this really great session. Okay, so I think we're all familiar with the huge success that climate modelers have had over the last few decades. And this just illustrates here the increasing level of processes that they represent now in their models. So they have what they term high fidelity models that are producing often now really quite rapidly climate forecasts, ensembles of climate forecasts, capturing uncertainty, etc., which are being used all the time in policy decisions. And they're successful at reproducing what's happened in the past, helping us understand what's happened in the past, and hopefully extrapolating into future space. But we're not at the same point in biodiversity forecasting. So if you go and look to see what types of forecasts there are globally for biodiversity, there's some good ones out there. Dirk just gave us another very nice example, but they tend to use really quite simple models, which are often statistical. Here's one example that came out a number of years ago. You can see it's using species distribution models at its heart, with some adaptations to them. Here's just one other example. This used red lists of species. So there's more process probably represented in there in terms of the red listing of species, but it's still not underlying. This is not a process-based model itself. So something very different still to what the climate modeling community are doing. And there's been, over the years, lots of calls for us as a biodiversity modeling community to move towards something that's more akin to what the climate modelers are doing. And there's a whole range of models now that do biodiversity projections or ecological predictions that go across a continuum from over on the left here, really correlative, simple models, over to the right, really what the climate modelers would call high fidelity process-based models. I'm going to tell you about one example from a model that Greta, who's one of the EcoCode leaders, developed a number of years ago and that we've used a lot at Aberdeen, and Damaris and co use a lot at Potsdam. It's called RainShifter. So RainShifter captures demography and dispersal at its heart. It can read in climate, it can read in land use, and it is designed to really produce projections around species distribution, species abundance, to test alternative management scenarios, etc. And we've used that model at local scales for a whole range of different species and made recommendations for landscape management, for managing invasive species, for promoting the range shifting of species, but they're all relatively local scale. And we want to now take the step towards making this type of high fidelity ecological model usable at global scale, ultimately. There are big challenges. So in terms of extending it spatially, the really big one is computational. Temporally, we've got computational costs too, if we want to project a long time into the future. Another really big challenge that we realized we had was to run these models, we need, for projections, high resolution projections of land use at a global scale. And it turned out that didn't really exist. And then if we want to run for many species, we have computational capacity, of course. We need data to parameterize. We're getting more of that. The living data that we're all discussing is helping with that hugely. We need that for dispersal demography, environmental niches, and then maybe other processes too eventually. So I'm just going to give you a couple of slides on what Tamsin Woodman, a PhD student in my group, she just finished relatively recently, did to crack this challenge of land use data. When she started her PhD, we thought it was just going to be a case of finding some land use data at annual frequency, at high spatial resolution that we could project out to, say, 2100. Just turned out that didn't exist. So rather than having an ecological PhD, she spent the whole time developing methods to downscale the projections that come from land use models such as Plum, which are part of LandSim, that tend to produce their output at 0.5 degree grid cell, way too coarse for the sort of ecological biodiversity models that we wanted to use. So this is now available for 4 different RCP scenarios globally. This is an example here for Colombia, where the land use at fine resolution can differ substantially depending upon which future we look at. So this is available for every year into the future at 1 kilometer resolution for the globe. I think really importantly, when you're thinking about land use at this fine resolution for biodiversity or ecological processes, you want to get the pattern of land use change right. So you don't want to just allocate land use change at the local scale in some random way. So what Tamsin did is she looked at the spatial pattern of land use change in each country around the globe over the last 10 years and used that to inform the pattern of land use change into the future. And the pattern of land use change, even the same land use change, so to forest, to arable, differs really substantially depending on where in the world you are. And that variability is shown in this map. So I think we've got that now. We've got the land use futures that we can at least start to use. So I think the next big challenge is the computational cost of scaling up to run at broad spatial scales, to run at long time horizons. And I think here we can start to adopt a method that has been really important and is becoming even more important in the climate modeling community, in climate science. That's using something called emulators. So an emulator is essentially a model of a model, and it may be a simple statistical model. Increasingly, it's using machine learning and AI, and it's really becoming game-changing in climate science. So one type of emulator, we'll touch on the different types in a bit, are emulators that emulate the final output of the model. So there's a very nice review that's just come out on emulators of climate model output. And there's been a real increase recently in how frequently this is being done. These are really 2 excellent papers if you want to look at this and how it's being used in climate science. So I want to give you an example now of how we've taken RainShifter to address what we think is an important question. Job Arben in the audience is led on this. And we've used emulation with RainShifter to allow us to do something that we wouldn't have been able to do before. So the broad question here is that in general, we think of linear infrastructure like railways or roads as being bad for biodiversity. But if we manage the verges well along that linear infrastructure, it may actually produce useful corridors for some species to be able to track climate change, for example. And SNCF, the French railway company, are part of this project. And the question is how could the French railway verge system provide sort of corridors for species to be able to better adapt to climate change? They have fantastic data. So here we wanted to look specifically at semi-natural grassland species. They have very high resolution data on their railway assets and the nature of verges. So this is from remote sensing. So we have 5 meter resolution data on exactly what's there. So here you've got the finest scale data. We can even see where sort of individual shrubs and trees are. So we wanted to run a model, wanted to run RainShifter at 5 meter resolution for the whole of France. For butterflies, butterflies have huge population sizes. It would take years if we wanted to do that computationally for lots of different scenarios, which is what we wanted to do. So the challenge was to build a fast model that relates the rate of range expansion of species to the landscape properties of, in this case, 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer cells of France. So the approach was to sample from the French landscape. We took about 270 10K by 10K cells, stratified across variation in landscape properties of France, ran range shifter for each of those to get the outputs, and then built, in this case, a statistical emulator that related the landscape characteristics to the rate of spread that we obtained. And the emulator captures about 66% of the variability, which is pretty good because there's also intrinsic uncertainty in here. So you couldn't possibly get close to 100%. And then once we've got that statistical model, we can use it actually to gain some interesting insights. So Job will talk more about this tomorrow. So look for Job's talk tomorrow. I don't have time for much of this now. One of the key things we understood is that the amount of improvement we get in how well species can shift if the verge is managed well for semi-natural grassland species depends upon the direction of the railway lines that are going through it and how well they align to climate velocity, the direction of climate velocity, to habitat area, and to the characteristics of the species. That's all shown over here. But then this is the bit we really want to get to. We can then take our statistical model and we can just extrapolate now using that statistical model to the whole of France. And you can see here, this is showing the projected rates at which 4 different butterfly species here would be able to spread through that landscape. And within here, you can see the linear features, which represent the railway tracks. So the dark blue areas are areas where there's not much semi-natural grassland in the landscape. But if you have semi-natural grassland along those railway verges, you can promote the spread through areas there where you would end up with sort of bottlenecks to range expansion. Okay, so the last bit, I just want to talk a little bit more about where we might go with this type of approach. I think a key question is, what do we emulate? Where within our modeling pipeline do we emulate? So one option is that we emulate the outputs of the model. So things in climate science, you might be interested in the mean monthly temperature of each grid cell or the probability of an extreme weather event. So there's an example here of that. There's been one very recent paper come out which looks at emulating LPJ gas, an ecosystem model that emulates how much forest carbon there is. Or what is happening more and more in the climate modeling community is you emulate a slow internal process that really results in the model going slowly. So it might be cloud microphysics, for instance. So you emulate a process like that. So in our ecological models, we might emulate the distribution of dispersal events rather than modeling each dispersal event as a mechanistic movement process. We do some emulation there. Or in type of model that Nat has, an ecophysiological model, you might emulate thermal performance rather than doing something which is computationally costly. So this is what output emulation looks like. So you take the inputs and outputs of the high fidelity model, you train your emulator on that, and you use it to do the projection. For hybrid emulation, you do something in the middle, where you train an internal emulator on processes that are going on within the model. And in the climate modeling community, they're just starting to actually do that online. So they don't do it all beforehand and use the relationships which they calculate beforehand. They do it online as the model's running, which is meant to be better for avoiding extrapolation errors. So another big issue is, how do we deal with the data that we have for many, many species? I'll skip through this quite quickly, but I think one way is to take more trait-based approaches in our modeling. And for environmental niches, representing that for many, many species, there are methods that are becoming available. There's a couple here. Or we can take the ecophysiological models, if we have the data to run them, to be able to build our niches. So I think bringing all of the data that we're compiling together as a community here to life and to make it useful really requires process-based models And to run that at scale is going to require emulation. So we're gaining bigger, better connected data. So we need now to link that to high fidelity models, which we can speed up through emulation, probably working with climate modelers that have already been doing this for a while. And then hopefully we need to get those types of models assimilated into policy and management. And with that, our end, and I have 30 seconds.
Thanks, Justin. We probably don't have time to squeeze in a question, but please find Justin after the session to ask more about this fascinating topic. Okay, so next up we have Damaris Zaro, attributing bird occupancy dynamics to past climate and land use change in North America.
Thanks, Nat. Hello, everybody. So I'm presenting a study by a colleague, Katrin Schifferle. That's her first chapter of her PhD, and it's about detection attribution of North American breeding birds. We all know that species are reacting both to climate change and to land use change. We could think that they might be shifting their ranges due to climate change, but we also have the effects of land use change, that there might be fragmentation going on, or possibly also new areas that become colonizable. And the question is, how do they interact together? And we wanted to know in that study, to what degree have climate and land use change contributed to past changes in the occupancy dynamics of North American breeding birds? We use the detection attribution framework for that to understand the relevant impact of those anthropogenic drivers. With the idea, if we understand the drivers better of the past, we also have a bit more confidence in predicting into the future. We will use a prediction-based attribution, which basically means that we are comparing the observed changes, or at least what our models predict as observations, to the predicted changes under counterfactual scenarios. So factual scenarios are basically also the drivers as we have observed them in the past. Counterfactual scenarios are detrending the drivers. So for example, detrending climate change, where we would still keep the variability, the normal variability in climate, but take out the trend. Yeah, and with land use change, it's even simpler because you can just fix land use change at a certain year as if nothing has changed. So we are fitting the models to the observations. You see that here. The black line represents the observations over time. The blue line, the models. They may not be perfect, right? And then we are using those models to make predictions under the counterfactuals as well. And from the difference between the trends we predict between the factual and counterfactual scenarios, we can assess what's the relative impact of the different drivers. And we could assume to find different things. So we can find absolute winners, which means that we observed or predict under the factual scenarios, we predict a positive trend that would not be there under the counterfactual trend. So that means the trends we have observed due to climate or land use change have been positive for the species. We could also have something like relative winners, which means that they have been that the trends have been more positive than under counterfactuals, but still not overall positive. And we can look at the same with relative losers and absolute losers. We use the fantastic data set of the North American Breeding Bird Survey for that. We only use later years. The survey has been going on since the 60s, but we will use data from 1995 onwards until 2019. The reason is because the models we use really need like transitions between the different sites. And from the 90s onwards, there were just simply more sites that have been observed over most of the years. So in total, we take a bit more than 500 locations, 500 survey routes. We have 192 species in those routes for which we have enough data to, well, at least try to fit those models. And we are using environmental data from EasyMap. So we use climate data from Chelsea, land use data from the LUH2 data set. We have an annual temporal resolution, a 50-kilometer spatial resolution. And the important bit is that we calculated the counterfactuals ourselves. So EasyMap is providing counterfactual data from 1901 onwards, or with a baseline of 1901. Here we take 1995 as the baseline, so basically the start of our bird observation data. We fit dynamic occupancy models. For those of you who don't know that, just a very quick wrap up. So we have occupied sites, and we have non-occupied sites, and we are trying to predict what's the extinction probability of an occupied site, what's the colonization probability of a non-occupied site, and we're trying to to fit those, how do those rates of extinction and colonization relate to climate and land use. Additionally, we need to predict something like the initial occupancy, and we are also controlling for detection probability. We fit that, or well, Katrin fit that using the Flocker package in R. In the end, we were able to fit that for 159 species for which the models converged. We validated those models using both a spatially blocked cross-validation and also a temporal validation, where we basically cut the time series into 70% of data to fit the models and the later 30% of the data to validate the models. So how well do they predict those trends? So let's go through those absolute winners, relative winners, absolute losers, and relative losers. Here you see first just the results for the climate impacts. In those columns, you see the trends that we have found for the species under the factual scenario. So what has actually been observed? And we see that it's important to note that this is only relating to 80 species, because I just show the results for the species that actually achieved like a really good predictive accuracy in our validation step. Okay. And from those 80 species, roughly 31 had a positive trend over the past or since 1995. And 45 species had a negative trend. Now we can predict those models to the counterfactuals. We see under the counterfactual climate, we would have expected a more positive trend for more species. And now we can have a look at how many absolute winners we have and relative winners, and how many relative and absolute losers we have. We can do the same under climate, under land use change. There we see less differences. So overall, we can say, first of all, that we see more global change losers than winners, and that climate change impacts have been more pronounced than the land use change impacts. When we want to know about the relative importance, we use a slightly different approach. We actually try to account for the error in our predictive model. So as I said at the beginning, right, the models might not be perfect, but we have like a small error in how well we predict the observed dynamics. And if we now compare the errors that we achieve under the factual simulations and the errors we get under the counterfactual simulations, we can use that as an indicator of the relative importance of the different drivers. And well, similar picture as we've seen for the trends, right? Climate change has been way more important for explaining the occupancy dynamics since 1995 than land use change. And when we look at both combined, the overall picture looks very similar to the relative importance of climate change. We can also look at that in a bit more detail. Please don't try to interpret every single icon you see on that figure. It just shows us for all of the different species, for all the 80 species that we considered in our last analysis, what was the relative importance of the different drivers. So either land use change or climate change or the both combined. We see that in the different symbols. And then in the colors, we indicate which of those species were absolute or relative winners or losers in our trend analysis. And what we can see is that we find a lot larger impact of climate change on, or we find, yeah, I can't read it there, so I have to look at that. So the relative impact that we found per species was much larger for the losers than for the winners. And that was the same for relative versus absolute losers. Okay. We also tried to look at the traits in a bit more detail, but that is really work that is still ongoing. So we did find, for example, a trait signature in the climate impacts when we looked at migratory birds versus sedentary birds or partially migrant birds. That was the most pronounced effects we saw. Otherwise, we can say that they don't seem to be huge trait signals, but a lot of species have been winners and losers. For the land use impacts, we could see that it's mostly the that again we find the largest impacts for the migratory species, but we also found species impacts for grassland species, for example, that were more pronounced than for other habitats, and there seems to be a slight signature of the lifestyle, so that we found overall like a smaller impact for more aerial species that might also tend to be more generalist. So the take-homes are that the changes we've seen over the roughly last 30 years in occupancy dynamics of North American breeding birds were mostly due to climate than to land use change. When I haven't shown that, but when we do the same kind of analysis for the baseline of 1901, we see a different picture. So over the entire 20th century, it's mostly land use change that has driven dynamics, but over the last 30 years, it's really climate change that has impacted the species much more. And that's really great if we put those models into the statistical detection attribution framework, because then we can really play around with those different drivers and can really separate the impacts of climate and land use change. And that should hopefully help us to understand the impact of drivers and then better inform future conservation and also improve our projections into the future. This study was, of course, only done with dynamic occupancy models. I mean, at least we heard from Nat that they also seem to be really good in comparison to other methods. But still, we could enhance future studies by, first of all, having longer time series and higher quality data, by testing at least more processes in our mechanistic models, and also potentially include other drivers. You know, pollution, invasive species, they all may have a large impact, but we don't have the counterfactual, or well, we don't have the driver information in the first place, and then not the counterfactuals. Thank you. And I should add that we are, of course, super grateful to all the volunteers who contribute data to the BBS surveys.
Perfect. Thank you, Damaris, and thank you for sticking to time. So we have time for a couple of questions. All right, we'll run a microphone up the back.
Hi, Damaris. Thank you. Great work. I was wondering, with the BBS data, so far, occupancy modeling work has struggled a bit and often or usually restricted itself to the point level data to address concerns about violating the closure assumption. So analysis is usually done at like 5 or 10 kilometer stretches or even smaller. So I'm wondering whether something about the method that you use makes us less worried about the closure assumption, or whether with the 50 kilometer resolution, could there be concerns that the sort of the violation of the closure assumption could bring about biases that could affect some of the results?
I mean, I'm happy to discuss that. The closure assumption, I was mostly concerned with that in other data sets when we were working, for example, with repeated surveys of butterflies, right? That you can't be sure when you have several peaks of of butterfly emergence that you can't be sure whether that was emigration or immigration. I'm less concerned that we have such an effect in the birds, but I'm very happy to discuss that. So what we used, at least in the detection probability, this is where we split the survey into smaller spatial scales to account for detection. We treated basically the survey as the repeated measures to get an idea about the detection probability. That's where we used multi-scale.
Okay, we might actually have to move on, but there was lots of other questions, so please find Damaris after the session. Thanks, Damaris. Okay. So next up, we have Francois Leroy, and he will be talking about a neural dynamic and mixture model, a deep learning framework to infer demographic rates from abundance data. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is François Leroy. I'm a first-year postdoc at the Ohio State University in Marta Jerzina's lab. And I am part of the AI and biodiversity change project, which aims at bringing together computer scientists and ecologists in order to use modern machine learning algorithms to better understand changes of biodiversity. So this work is part of this ABC project, where we implemented the dynamic and mixture model into a deep learning framework to infer demographic rates from count data. So when we think about biodiversity changes and the impact of human activities on biodiversity, usually a very closely monitored metric is the change in local abundances. While changes in local abundances are valuable, we also know that it is the results of underlying mechanisms, such as the recruitment of individuals, which would be the sum of birth and immigration, and the loss of individual, which would be the sum of death and emigration. So understanding how survival and loss change over time can help us better understand the type of biodiversity crisis we're facing. So for instance, if we think about a mass extinction, usually we think that it's an increase in the death rate, but it's actually the opposite, right? If you look at geological layers of mass extinction, there is a lack of life, which means that the environment becomes more and more stressful, less and less resources, so you have less eggs produced, less successful fledglings, which leads to a slow decline of life on Earth. So better understanding and monitoring changes in survival and recruitment can help understand the biodiversity crisis and also tailor efficient conservation strategies. The problem when we want to model these demographic rates is that we need a very specific type of data, right? We need this individual encounter history data. While for some taxa and some species, the use of camera trap and computer vision has been very helpful. For other taxa, such as birds or fish, you still need to capture, mark, and recapture the individual. So of course, this is a very costly process, both in terms of resources and time. Also, it can be traumatic for the individuals, and so it leads this data to be very restricted in space and time. But on the other end, we have a lot of abundance data, right? So what we can do is leverage the amount of abundance data to infer this demographic rate. So the idea of inferring demographic rates from abundance data is not new. This is called the stochastic linear birth-death process. And so the idea here is that while the change in abundance will give you information about the difference between birth rate and death rate, the volatility of the time series or the variance of the time series will give you information on the sum of birth rate and death rate. And so if you have the difference and the sum of these two processes, you can identify these two processes, right? So for instance, here you have 4 different scenarios. For the 4 scenarios, the change in abundance is the same. It's always -1, but you can see that the values of birth rate and death rate are very different. And this is clearly visible from the shape of the time series. So it exists statistical implementation in discrete time of this stochastic linear birth-death process, and this is called the dynamic and mixture model. So this is a hierarchical model, which is very common in ecology, right? So we have a first layer where the observed data, the observed abundance, will be drawn from a binomial distribution with a detection probability P and the true latent abundance N. And then you have the second layer, the ecological part, where the abundance, the true latent abundance, will be used as a parameter of binomial distribution with a survival probability phi, which will give you the number of survivors at time t+1. For the number of new individuals you will use a Poisson distribution with parameter gamma, and the sum of survival and recruitment will give you the abundance at time t+1. For the abundance at time 1, you need an independent Poisson distribution with a lambda parameter. So in this kind of framework, what you say usually is that the probabilities here, or the logit of this probability and the log of those Poisson parameters are dependent on a linear combination of covariates, right? The thing is that it's very restrictive in the assumption you make between the relationship between the covariates and the parameters, right? Also, these kind of models are usually implemented in the Bayesian setting with the Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithms, which is inherently sequential, so you cannot parallelize the learning. Also, you need some priors and initial values, but anyway, the thing that you could say, okay, let's use neural networks because they are way more flexible in the relationship between the covariates and the parameters. Also, they are way faster because you can parallelize the learning. The problem is that if you fit a neural network, usually you would put your observed data, right, in the output layer. And if you do so, basically you will forget about the correction for the detection probability, and most importantly, you will forget about the inference of survival and recruitment, which makes this model so interesting. But there is a way to use best of both worlds, let's say, and this was published in Ecology Letter by Maxwell Joseph in 2020. And it's called a neural hierarchical model. So here, the idea is to really combine the flexibility and the scalability of neural networks with the inferential power of hierarchical models. What I really like with this method is that it combines decades of development of hierarchical models by ecologists for ecologists with all the advantages that neural networks bring to the table. So the main idea here is to tailor your own loss function. So the thing is that usually this kind of neural network, this kind of hierarchical models, they come with a likelihood. So of course, with this likelihood, you can straightforwardly implement the negative log likelihood, which would become your loss function, and thus you can perform the backpropagation algorithm. And also you need to pick the proper output activation function. So for instance, here, if we look at a simplified version of the neural dynamic and mixture model, you can see that in the output layer, you would put the parameters of interest, so the abundance at time 1, the recruitment, the survival probability, the detection probability. For the Poisson parameter, you would use an exponential activation function. And for the probabilities, you would use a sigmoid activation function. And then the whole difficulty is to link the inferred values of those parameters to a loss here, which will include the count data. So what we can do is take a step back and look at a simpler version of this model. So just the N-mixture model, where you just have the detection part and the abundance at time t. You can see that this is the integrated likelihood with the detection part here, the ecological part here. And then you have this sum over any possible values of abundance, true latent abundance. So usually in the Bayesian setting, what you are going to do is that you're going to sample one value of n here, compute the likelihood, and you will sample this value 1,000, 100,000 times, and you will get the posterior distribution. The thing is that here it's not possible because it's a neural network setting. So what you do is that you marginalize over a very high value of k here. So let's say that in your data set, you observe maximum 20 individuals. So what you can do is that you can make the assumptions that the true latent abundance wouldn't be more than 500 individuals. And so you would marginalize the likelihood over this very high value of abundance. So let's have a look at the likelihood of this of the model of interest, the dynamic and mixture model. So here you can see the similarities, the detection part, the Poisson at time 1, and then you have this new term here, this new element, and this is the key part of this model. So the P here is a matrix. This is the transition matrix, and this transition matrix will involve the information about survival and recruitment. So a transition matrix is really a key part of a hidden Markov model. It will involve the transition between abundance at time t and abundance at time t+1. And each element of this abundance, of this transition matrix, will be the sum of the joint probabilities of all the possible combinations of survival and abundance that will sum up to a value of abundance at time t+1 here. So here, each row of this transition matrix is a probability density function. It will sum up to 1, and it will give you for any value of abundance at time t, the probability of transitioning to any value of abundance at time t+1. So what we can do is visualize this transition matrix for two different extreme cases. One case where the survival probability is 0, and the change in abundance is only relies only on the recruitment with parameter 10. And you can see that in this situation, transition matrix will look very vertical like that, with the highest probability close to 10. In another case where the survival probability is 1 and there is absolutely no recruitment here, you can see that the transition matrix will look very will be diagonal like that. So of course, in reality, you have an in-between, and this is how the transition matrix can inform about the processes of survival and recruitment just using abundance data. So here you can see that the transition matrix is very small. It's just a 20 by 20. But as I said, in reality, it would be way bigger, right? It can be 500 times 500. And also the fact is that for each time step, you will have this transition matrix, each time step of the time series. And for each time series, so it's and then for each element of the transition matrix, you need to perform this computation. So this is clearly the bottleneck of this implementation of this model in the neural network setting. So here, what I decided to do was to go for a fast but heavy memory implementation. So what I decided to do was to create all of these transition matrices in a row over the batch size, and then perform all of these computations in one go, which is this kind of computations are perfect for GPUs, right? So it's a very time gain. So for instance, here I tried on a known data set. And it was known to take 88 minutes in a Bayesian setting, and here it was taking only 15 minutes with this implementation, with a very simple GPU, only 8 GB of RAM, right? Okay, so now that the loss function is implemented, what I did is that I simulated some data. I wanted to test the model on simulated data. So I simulated a simple quadratic relationship between one covariate and all the parameters for 300 sites, 15 years long time series, and 5 repeated counts. So here, for instance, this is the abundance at time 1. So the blue dots are the true latent abundance, the ones that you try to predict, and the black dots are the observed abundance, the ones that you try that you will use in the computation of the loss function, right? This is the observed. The black dots are the observed data. Here you have the survival probability, or survival probability, detection probability, and number of recruits here. And then what's nice is that when you feed the model, you can see that the neural network, epoch after epoch, will learn the correct relationship between the parameters of interest and the covariates. So for instance, here each lines represent an epoch, and the more yellow the epoch, the later the epoch. And you can see that after only 300 epochs, the model has inferred the correct relationship between the parameters of interest and the covariate. So here, the neural network is the most basic neural network you can imagine. It's a simple multi-layer perceptron. There is one hidden layer, only 64 hidden units. But now that the loss function is implemented, what's quite nice is that you can plug whatever architecture of neural networks to this loss function. And I think the most exciting application of this framework now is to plug a convolutional neural network to this loss function. And the idea here would be to use some satellite images with abundance data at large spatial and temporal scales, and assess how the features of the landscape will influence survival and recruitment rates. So it could be very important to better understand how landscape management influence those demographic rates at large spatial scales, and could provide actual efficient guidelines for conservation strategies. Just a quick word, if I have time, about the limitations of this model. So this model is known to sometimes be struggle to infer the values of recruitment and survival. This is not true for the abundance. For the abundance, the model is pretty good, but for the recruitment and survival, usually it tends to overestimate a tiny bit the survival rate. This is a bit visible already on this simulations here. You can see that the survival rate is slightly higher than the real simulated one. And then, of course, there is this, marginalization over K. Of course, if it's too small, the likelihood will be biased. If it's too big, you will tend to overwhelm your memory. So you will have either to get a better GPU or to play with the batch size to not overwhelm the RAM. And so I will skip this and I will, okay. I will just like the acknowledgements. Yeah, okay, perfect. So I would like to thank Marta Yarzina for welcoming me in our lab and for her help in this project. And also I would like to thank all the people from the ABC Global Center. It's a really huge project. This is just a small subsample of all the persons involved in this project. Some of them are here in this conference, so feel free to discuss with them. It's an amazing project. And finally, I'd like to thank Maxwell Joseph, the author of the Ecology Letters paper, because we had the opportunity to discuss and his guidance was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've run out of time for questions, but please follow up after the session. Thank you. So, next up, we have Courtney Davis, who's going to be talking about leveraging deep learning joint species distribution models and participatory science data for scalable biodiversity modeling.
Good afternoon, everyone. I first want to take a moment to thank the organizers of the conference and the organizers of the symposium. It's been a really inspiring day and a half. I'm looking forward to the next few days. So I don't want to spend too much time since we had such a great introduction from Natalie at the beginning of this session, but we're all sort of interested in understand the need to scale inference on biodiversity, doing this across spatial scales, temporal scales, and levels of organization. And there are lots of challenges, as we all know, in doing this. As Natalie pointed out, a lot of those focus on the need for high resolution data on biodiversity, but also on the environments that species are occurring in. It also requires that we have computationally efficient approaches that allow us to scale across these different axes while also incorporating or accounting for the complexity across different natural systems. And so today I want to focus on the use of participatory science data to sort of meet one of these challenges. Participatory science data in general is sort of a promising and growing avenue for biodiversity data globally. I'll focus on the use of eBird. How many eBirders are in the room? Great, thanks in advance for your contributions to this talk. eBird has grown now to over 2.1 billion observations. I think that number is actually out of date, by over 1 million contributors around the world. It includes observations for about 10,000 species. So it's a really sort of unique and vast wealth of information on birds around the world. What we like to say for those of us that analyze eBird data is that it's often more about modeling the people that are submitting the data and less about the birds. And that's because with participatory science, one of the unique challenges is actually understanding the different axes of human variation that are sort of reflected in those data themselves. So this includes things about, differences in observer skill, to identify species, to detect species, to count species. People are actually really terrible at counting. Everyone has different sort of behaviors when they go out to collect observations. They exert a different amount of effort, and they choose their sites that they bird very differently. And so this is sort of a unique component of using eBird data and participatory science in general that we need to account for. And that means that we have to have additional features included in our models that allow us to really account for this heterogeneity, so that we're making unbiased predictions about the birds themselves. And so that means that on top of all of the environmental information that we need to have, we're quickly sort of reaching the limit of the number of covariates that are included in more traditional statistical frameworks. And so that's where the sort of promise of AI comes into play. And so AI, especially in recent years, there's a lot of sort of unique components where it really allows us to leverage these large biodiversity data sets. It's unlocking new and exciting environmental data streams, including things like hyperspectral information and other image-based, satellite-based images. And that allows us to then scale to more accurate inference on biodiversity. There are challenges, though, with AI models, one of which being that we often are sort of sacrificing interpretability for predictive power across these different approaches. And so that means that we often aren't able to extract information about the processes that are driving the patterns that we see in biodiversity. And today I want to focus just on one example of this and sort of the work that we're doing to try and improve interpretability sort of on those underlying processes while also improving our ability to make predictions across species, space, and time. So the example that I want to focus on is deep learning joint species distribution models. So the underlying model for this framework was actually developed by our collaborators, Dr. Carla Gomes and the Institute for Computational Sustainability at Cornell. It was first developed for crystal phase mapping for materials discovery. And so naturally we thought, oh, let's apply it to biodiversity data. So that's what we did. In this application, we leveraged over 9 million eBird checklists in North America. We leveraged information on 72 high-resolution environmental covariates and made predictions on the spatiotemporal distributions, the habitat associations, and the species associations of 500 species. Just to put this into perspective, at the time of this study, the most sort of detailed application of joint species distribution models included information from just under 31,000 sites, but only included for environmental covariates for about 600 plant species. And so this approach really allows us to sort of scale our inference, both in terms of how we're capturing that environmental complexity that's driving species distributions, but also scaling across many more sites in space and in time. And I do want to note that this application was sort of limited to 500 species, but we've now scaled this to over 1,500 species at a time with 120 to 150 environmental covariates. So this framework is a deep learning or relies on a deep learning neural network. It also sort of embeds a two-part structured latent space that allows us to make inference about species habitat associations, as well as the potential interactions among species. We have 3 types of outputs from this approach. Like most species distribution models, we can make predictions about the occurrence and also the relative abundance of individual species, as well as make community level inference on species richness. We can understand how species are interacting with their environment and also how they're potentially interacting with each other. Just to give you a sense of what these outputs look like, this is an example of year-round species richness produced at a monthly temporal resolution and a 3 kilometer by 3 kilometer spatial resolution for a set of warbler species across North America. And you can see the sort of dynamic patterns that we would expect during the migration time periods. This allows us to sort of have high resolution information about where these species are distributed across space and time. We can also, using the embeddings from the model, understand about those species habitat relationships. So this is an example of how we would summarize that embedding. I don't expect you to be able to read anything on here. We'll zoom in a second, but this is across all of those species for just the northeastern US in a single month. This can be read much like a phylogeny, where species that are closer together on this tree are those that are more similar to each other in their habitat preferences. And so we can zoom in and sort of sanity check the relationships that our model is picking up on. And we can see that there are some sort of known clustering of species that are associated with more interior forests or mixed coniferous deciduous forests. And so this gives us a lot more trust in using the model to sort of do data-driven discovery of species habitat relationships and sort of the similarity across the species within a region. We can also use the information on the species-to-species association embedding to understand how species are correlated with one another in space and time. So this is an example, again, for warbler species in the northeastern US, showing sort of the residual correlations between species. So the squares that aren't brown indicate that those species are less likely to co-occur. Squares that are in green or blue are those that are more likely to co-occur. And what's pretty unique about this approach is that we can actually look at this in each month or even a finer scale each week of the year and see how those associations change through time. So here we're looking at the breeding season on the left and the migratory season on the right. And so we can see sort of the associations and the potential interactions across these species has really changed, and that's sort of known. Warblers are known to exist in co-species migratory flocks during this time, and we can actually pick up on those associations here. So I want to next focus on, with that model, we can understand some of the ecological processes using sort of our knowledge that species are influenced not just by their environment, but by other co-occurring species. But sort of the way the model is structured, it doesn't allow us to sort of isolate the individual effects of different environmental features on individual species. And that's because the deep learning model itself, in its standard prediction-focused sort of architecture, really sort of lumps all of these features together and analyzes them in a single neural network. So this allows for a lot of flexibility in how species might associate with these different types of covariates, as well as the interactions between these covariates, but it doesn't allow us to isolate the impact of individual covariates on individual species. And so working with a graduate student, Mark Grimson, at the Institute for Computational Sustainability, we've developed a more process-focused deep learning architecture, which allows us to sort of constrain the potential interactions between different types of features to those that we know or expect to occur. So we know that, for example, the different features that I described about how people collect data can be influenced by the environment in which they're collecting that information. So urban centers, it can be often harder to hear certain species. In more forested areas, it can be harder to detect certain species. We also know that the sort of habitat conditions that individual species experience are driven both by the land cover that's there, but also by the topography. And we know that topography and climate can also interact to sort of create these experience conditions, climatic conditions that a species occurs within. And so this process-focused model architecture actually uses a neural network for each of those different components independently. And this allows us to then combine them through additivity, much like our standard sort of regression model. And this then allows us to pull out the influence of those individual components on species. And so this example I just want to focus was really sort of focused on climate and understanding the impact of climate independent of land use. And again, it's sort of a sanity check. After running this model, we pulled out 2 species within the northeastern US that are known to be sensitive to climate in sort of different ways. And what we can actually see is that the model is able to pick up on these distinct range boundaries across these 2 species that are driven by climate and not land use. And so in having sort of that sanity check, we can then scale across many more species and across space and time, and understand then sort of the relative importance of climate versus land cover for different types of species in different regions and in different seasons throughout the year. And so there's a lot of promise in embedding ecology within these deep learning architectures to make sure that we can leverage sort of the wealth of both observational and environmental data, but not sacrifice our ability to understand the process and sort of some of the underlying mechanisms that are driving the patterns that we see. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. And if anyone is interested in grad or postdoc opportunities or know someone, let me know. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for some questions. Questions? Mark?
I know it's lunchtime, so thanks.
Great, really interesting. And I guess I'm interested
in the idea of the interactions, and I think you were very careful to say potential interactions.
Was.
You were, yeah. And so, obviously you have these correlations that could be habitat, it could be a bunch of different things, but I'm wondering, as you move toward more constrained analyses, if you could actually start to embed things like the expected interactions between predators and prey or true competitors, something like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So as we've sort of moved more to this process-based architecture, sort of with the environmental features, we've moved a little bit away from the species to species associations. One, because it's a little harder to scale or have the information to help embed sort of known interactions between species. If we're talking about 500 species, there's often not literature to understand what the potential interactions could be or what the direction of those potential interactions could be across species. And so we haven't embedded anything related to those interactions within the model, although there is potential to sort of constrain what is known or what we might expect. It's a question.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. And thank you, Courtney.
Yep.
Okay, so next up we have Pep Sarah Diaz, who's be talking about an early warning system for biodiversity.
Wow. Perdón. Sí, yo soy más bajito. Ya, yo creo que ahí va bien. Gracias. Okay, let's go. Hola, hello. Thanks for being here today. Today I'm going to be talking about this idea. It's a prototype of an early warning system for biodiversity and warnings related to climate change, a specific driver of climate change, which is heat and temperature. Just as a little bit of a disclaimer, this is in my entire career, and I think in this session, this is the least modeling or fancy modeling that you will see. But hopefully you get to the point and hopefully the idea around it. So let's get it started. So I'm gonna be quick here. I move a lot, so this is gonna be tough. Okay, so let's start with this. Of course, I mean, we know that the Earth is warming, and it's warming at a super fast rate that we've never seen in a lot of years and thousands of years, millions. We see in these anomalies that it's pretty clear that it's happening and it's increasing. And through this anomaly graph, we see also that these are like monthly temperatures, that there's peaks and there's extreme events that are happening. Oh, hay que dar ahí, ¿no? Wow. Oh, this is what's happening to everyone. Bueno, a ver. No me sale esto, ¿eh? Bueno, no sé. ¿Le puedo dar una para atrás? ¿Una para adelante? Bueno, no sé. We'll just keep going. Okay, thank you. So this is the Living Data Conference. So we have, we are going to say and tell ourselves that, yes, we did a great job, but we still have to do a lot of things. And yeah, there's a lot of data. And the approach of scientists, and more we try to be effective and try to inform, policies and stuff, right? Like, so we do the best we can with what we have. So doing the best we can with what we have, probably a lot of the times it's based on occurrence data, and we see that in this conference quite a lot, and expert ranges, so where species are. And this is like, even though we're trying to have this time series and these complex models for a lot of species, this is what we have, if we actually have it. Then thanks to the efforts of people like Derek here, we start to have some high resolution from 1 to 4 kilometers. We call that good. Of climatologies right now, and up to 2100 based on different scenarios, GCMs, you name it. So it's pretty cool. What we do, and we've been doing that I picked some classics. I don't know if you recognize here. Like what we do is relate those data occurrences to climate. We go to 2100 and we'll say, hey, this is going bad. This is gonna go bad. And so this is what we've been doing for a long time. And the reason why we keep doing it, and I do it, so it's because it's a lot of the times for these tiny species is what you can do. to inform someone about the potential changes. But what's going on, it's this. So this is 2024, last year, world record of temperatures, heat strokes for a lot of howler monkeys in Mexico. And this is what's happening, and is a lot of the people are trying to save those people, those guys, and they want to do something. So there's a little bit of disconnect about what we're trying to save on the ground for a lot of people, and sometimes our models that are pretty fancy when we can do it, but they're also fancy, but they're also disconnected in the temporal scale of how things are happening. So what is happening is that every year, there's more and more species exposed to temperatures that they've never seen before. How this is done, this is a paper recently published by Corey Merrow for vertebrates, where we see that this is increasingly the number of species that they are seeing conditions within their distributions out of the conditions that they've experienced in the last 40 to 50 years. So this, we don't know if it actually means something on the ground, but from what we're seeing, it seems like this is happening. And if you just do a smooth line here, doesn't look really good. When we try to do something about it, sometimes it's not enough, but sometimes we just try to, in Spanish, we say save the dishes, in Spanish from Spain, sorry. So it means, like you do what you can. So sometimes when there's like these temperature or like drought events, you do things like that, translocations, supplementary feedings, water holes, just trying to guide, you would just want them to survive, right? Under these events. But even our most simple models, which are like SDMs or what we call exposure models, use projections that are so far away, and they're not targeted to actually cope with these extreme events. They don't capture these things. They're really not made to tell you, this is what's gonna happen next year, in 5 years. And this is a little bit of a disconnect of what's going on the ground. However, there's products and there's things out here that they're like climate scientists, they're using to actually do that. And there's a whole science around it that I think we're not using it as ecologists and biogeographers that could inform other processes. So while we have these 2,100 scenarios that are really good for scenario planning, there's other kind of projections, climate projections, that could inform strategic planning of biodiversity in 10 years, or maybe mitigation action. Today, I plan to talk about this. Andreas will talk about this tomorrow. So I'm going to be talking about like S2S and what we call subseasonal to seasonal forecasting in climate products. But we're going to apply it to biodiversity as an early warning system. The thing is, like, these forecasts, sorry, this is horrible. No sé si cogerlo. These forecasts are forecasts that are made in 9 months ahead. And they keep every month, they keep doing it. They have daily, hourly data, basically, and they predict a certain amount of variables. It's in development, so there's not like, it's not like these are models that are still in a lot of development. There's a lot of there, but we're still working on them. But they're actually being used to predict flood risks. They're being used to also for hurricane prediction. So basically, why not doing it for biodiversity? This was our little question. So we tried to do that. So in this 2025, we went back to 2024, a really bad year, and see if we could actually predict something like that. So what we did is basically we use expert ranges, and we trained that on the hindcast of that forecasting system, GMOs S2S of the NASA. And basically, we defined different kind of thresholds or exposure thresholds, thermal thresholds for species. Thresholds to say, okay, the species in the past, they've never seen or experienced that temperature, is what we call extreme or annual thresholds. Or for that specific month, May, this is actually warmer that it's never experienced by the species for a given May. So the one might be related to more mortality processes, the second one more to phenological changes. And then we can actually forecast 9 months ahead of time, see if we could actually, those extreme events were actually captured somehow by these species. So these are like kind of the little bit of our results here for 32,000 species of vertebrates. Basically what we saw is like we had like For 1,000 species, it's really hard not to look at there. It's like teaching thing. Okay, so for 1,000 species, at least we found that there's half of the range were exposed to extreme temperature for the 9 months. So that was the May forecast. In May 2024, we started forecasting, and this is what we saw. For at least 11% of our species, there were at least some point in the 9 months ahead where that month was much warmer than what the species experienced in that specific month. So if you know your species and they're breathing at that time, you know, these are like kind of the patterns, like you can see a little bit like Central America, but also like Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as some parts of Australia, actually for the monthly forecast. And these are more or less kind of the trends for the 9 months from May 2024 to February 2025. This is the most boring slide. I'm gonna go fast, but basically it's like, what we say is like, if you use Era 5, so the actual data of what happened, do these predictions align to once you have the real data that happened? And the answer is yes, they're accurate, but maybe for some species, you cannot pinpoint within the range the exposure happened. Then the other thing that we saw, it's actually for 24% of our species, 24% of the species of conservation concern using IUCN red listing. For 24 of those, there was some exposure happening. What you can do with that is like, how do you inform, right? So you inform that this is something that ecology, I don't like to do this, but I think it was useful. And in a way, what we said is like, well, who are the targeted audience for this? And probably it's political divisions or agencies at the regional or subnational level who might use that information. So we kind of did a parallel based on the IUCN red listing of ecosystems. We used kind of the similar thing to prioritize, or to see where in which places where provinces and other, well, you know, it changes through countries, but that kind of level, provinces where exposure for a lot of species would happen. So we can actually have regional hotspots and we can identify those. In general, we could warn for this particular May 2024 forecast from May to February 2025, we actually could maybe provide a warning between 3 and 5 months in general, depending on the place and, you know, changes a little bit. For ecologists, they like to see that better. So which ecoregions were mostly hit, like parts of the Sonoran Desert, but especially the Caribbean, as well as some parts of the Himalaya, especially. And another thing that one can do with that information, even though that's very simple information, it's very simple modeling, but it's actually prioritize where the efforts should be. And those efforts, you know, using multivariate prioritization scheme, we actually identified that both the Himalayas as well as the Caribbean were places where we should focus on mitigation actions and potentially monitoring. We don't have the time for actually validation. Imagine like you try to publish something in 1 year, no one, you know, between preparing the data, you don't have a lot of data, but we performed some pseudo validation using great literature and some reports. And we actually saw that there was a high correlation with that exposure and events that happen in there. Pseudo validation, but it's what we have. So different forecasts, I mean, this was to say that different products, and I think the climate science is giving us a lot more breadth than what we have in terms of CMIP6. We have a lot of other products that we could be using. Each product and each forecast serves to a different purpose. And in our case, I defend that those seasonal forecasts get into mitigation. Of course, we need more data to support species exposure modeling. What you could use, if you've got data, you could use the model for, you know, like critical thermal temperatures. You have them. You get the CTA, go for it. You want more data and get a better range, you know, limit. We should have that, and you could potentially improve your model. But what we're trying to defend here also is that it's not only about getting more data, but it's also about getting better data for a particular thing. And how we're doing it, how we think and what we're trying to develop from this, it's actually getting for, if we could forecast where things may happen in the next 6-7 months, one can think about monitoring the pre and the post and better inform potential impacts, and going from exposure, like this could potentially could be, do something about it, to actually this is the exact process for that variable and this is the outcome of what we've seen. So with that, I'll thank you and everyone. If you've got any questions, feel free to here or later. And I'm looking for a postdoc, just saying.
Thank you, Kat. I think we have time for a question.
I think it's on now. Okay, cool. Thanks so much. Really fascinating and inspiring talk. I'm wondering, so I mean, one of the reasons that we don't really capture these extremes in the sort of long-term models is that they're sort of, I don't know, ensembled and whatnot so many times. Have you been thinking about maybe doing some comparisons between these sort of short-term models and the long-term models to see if there's any ways that we could maybe improve the long-term models to get a better understanding of also these extreme events?
Yeah, well, I haven't done it myself. I know some of my climate colleagues are actually doing that. I encourage you to come tomorrow because Andres is going to talk about these kind of comparisons to CMIP versus S2S, or well, the CADL, he does the CADL, but I'm not sure about like how they can improve. What I see in general, how they do it, it's by systematically, they compare these S2S to this CMIP6 prediction for whatever month they've been doing. And they seem to be capturing much better those. But that's kind of normal, I guess. Like they look at synoptic dynamics that you cannot capture with CMIP6. So I don't know how the reverse is going. They seem to be like, from speaking to them, I'm not a climate person, so that they're developing kind of independent, not independently, because the physics are kind of the same, but of course they need to constrain and simplify the model. So when some people look at this, S2S look more at the weather people than actually the climate people. So yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And in interest of staying on time, we'll leave it there, but thanks, Pep. Okay, so our last speaker in our session is Yvonne Lebras, who will be talking about galaxy ecology, a forgotten potential framework who can help in biodiversity modeling.
Hello, everyone. 2 weeks ago, I was presenting galaxy ecology at a galaxy conference in Germany, and I was singing, so I don't think I have to sing, but I just can think one thing, because this is algorithm is love. Algorithm is love, baby, yeah. So maybe it can fit the session, but we will see in another moment. Sorry for that. In fact, this presentation comes from the reading of the Coding for Life paper from 2022 from Mark and colleagues, where I see that there is no platform who can fit for projecting and helping to share models. And I was not really sure it was true, because in my opinion, the Galaxy platform we are using now since 8 years to prove that we can use existing something like a platform to allow data science for everyone. This is the punchline of Galaxy, even if it's originally from bioinformatics. Can be something of interest for all these modeling things. And I think we need to think about that and maybe test it to do that. So now I can just present you a little bit about galaxy ecology and what we have done looking at modeling, and see if it can give some information, questions, comments on that. First of all, we take 7 years to produce the paper on galaxy ecology, and it's Colin Royot who drives this amazing work. Amazing because I am too oriented towards platform tools and technical things. And Colin's arrived to produce this beautiful article saying just, we are here to giving you classical generic information about how we can analyze ecological data, looking at feedbacks we have gathered in 7 years of trying to create galaxy ecology. So really thank you, Colin, for this work. And the basis of this work is, in fact, to show that we have to consider data analysis in ecology, maybe through this, what we call atomization and generalization framework. So this is something quite simple, I think, but really important. And this is described as this graphical abstract, where we see that, in fact, taking a raw script, R script, Python script, I don't know which kind of things, we have to think about atomization in analytical steps who are units of interest to separate for the rest, and then to see how we can look at bridging each analytical steps one on each other. And after that, we can work on a generalization of each step to look if it's relevant or not, and when it's relevant or when we can. So we can maybe work on that. So from our scripts, who can create indicators on birds, for example, we can maybe produce a modular things who can produce the same kind of results, but on other taxonomic and or temporal and or geographic extent, in fact. And after that, we just have to technically publish each bricks as a separate analytical bricks we can reuse, for example, in a workflow platform, workflow management dedicated platform or something like that. So to showcase a little bit this idea of atomization, generalization, but in another manner to see, this is to look more at the variables, in fact, and notably at essential biodiversity variables. But what is behind is the primary variables. And the idea is to just look at the fact that often the entrance of tools or modeling workflows or things like that are data where we need to have primary variables, for example, looking at location, temporal things, taxonomic range, and maybe variables like occurrences or abundances. And in fact, if we look at several data sets we can use in such conceptual workflow, we see that even if they are organized differently, even if the names of the columns are different, in fact, we can just rethink about the fact that we can make a link between this particular specific term and a generic term who is from the generalization I mentioned just before. And so we can have bricks, analytical bricks, who can take the three kind of data sets, just bridging, for example, the specific names to the name we choose on the bricks. And at the end, we can use the same kind of analytical models or things like that to generate visualization or indicators with the same analytical methods. So in 7 years, we make a lot of proof of concept of this idea. And here I just present the last one where we are working on Antarctic conservation. And just to illustrate this, we see that we produce from a researcher R scripts a pipeline into galaxy ecology to produce eco-regionalization. And after that, we look at them in Antarctica, and we look at the manner to reproduce the workflows, but in different kind of data, notably from invertebrates to fishes, and in another geographical extent from Antarctica to Atlantic. And after that, we try another thing who is allowed by the platform itself, is that we can change the parameter we want to give to the models we are using. So here it's a boosted regression tree, for example. And so here you see that different maps are generated with the same workflow, just providing not the same environmental variables. And it's just some clicks, some execution, and we have comparable results, and we can take a coffee when the processing is ongoing. So we made a lot of work on galaxy ecology to prove or to test it can be really an operational solution for EBVs, related indicators production. So we made workflows for genetic composition, for species population, species traits, and accompanied tutorials, community composition, more recently ecosystem functioning, notably thanks to remote sensing data, and ecosystem structure. And we created each time workflows, tutorials, and things like that to help working on that. If you want to look at galaxy ecology, the best entrance is to go to Galaxy Ecology and training material. We made a lot of tutorial. It's not perfect maybe, but you can, it's on GitHub, you can propose to ameliorate it. Please don't hesitate. Now we are working on several particular topics, notably in citizen science and crowdsourcing. Since 5 years, we are experimenting the use of Galaxy platform to face the two major issues we have in crowdsourcing platforms. So to have the possibility to have a number of users who is effectively big and not just a few percentage of the people who are using the crowdsourcing platform, and to have a constant participation with time without pushing any kind of money, animation, or something like that. So we just created a tools in 2 days 5 years ago, and I'm just counting the resulting we gather on this. And related to that, we have all the annotation of media with also a hot topic we need to work on. I have a talk tomorrow to precise more what we are doing using AI on Galaxy, just on some example, notably on deep learning, media annotation, or things like that. And so modeling and data visualization. So I'm not sure, but it appears to me that a lot of things we are doing in Galaxy related to modeling is also often related to visualization. So I just copy pasted some visualization you can produce on Galaxy to give you some example. It came from quality check on genomics data. You can have information about NetCDF data, remote sensing, or a citizen science project where people are looking at the building blocks on the sands. Our obese indicators, you can compute directly on Galaxy if you want, and things like that. So just to give you some direct, wonderful screenshot, I can give a live demo if you want, of what we can do with Galaxy regarding modeling. So I just take from some workflows we have, some tools we have regarding modeling. So here, for example, it's the BRT tool we are using with producing the eco-regionalization of Antarctica, or I use also for the fish in Atlantica. And briefly, you see here, it's the form to execute the R code with behind, or the Python code, or any kind of language. And you see that in the history here, and at the right, you have, in fact, an history of all the steps you use individually, one by one, or through a workflow. So you have a tracking of the provenance of all the computation you made. So yeah, you obtain this kind of results at the end of the workflow, and you can share each data set if you want, your history if you want, the workflow if you want, privately or to the Earth. Thank you. Another showcase is here when we were creating the first workflow in Galaxy to create indicators from breeding bird survey in France to reproduce the result we are using in France. So it's an example where you can see that we can compute some modeling on the results on the data, and have some metrics with classical things we can have in R, for example. Yeah, another one here using GAM or GLMTMB, when we see that we can produce comparable figure with the same workflow or same tools. Yeah, we can work on we have some tools that are dedicated to population evolution by species or community metrics, like here on breeding bird survey. Yeah, one thing is that behind this Galaxy things, who are just each Galaxy tool is a web form, but behind you have R scripts or Python scripts or other scripts you can reach because it's on the Galaxy Ecology GitHub account, and you can use it or reuse it inside or outside of Galaxy if you want, and propose modification too. Another thing I want to illustrate is one major things we have had as feedback is to have clear flags on the results, because this is a clicking platform, so everyone can make what he wants, and he can make a lot of issues. In my opinion, it's not an issue, because I think the most issue we have is that we don't have access to data processing tools and things like that. But anyway, that's true that a real importance is also to to give information, to highlight how the results of an analysis is of interest or not, is relevant or not, and to guide the user to maybe re-analyze with other parameter or something like that. So this is something we made here to have criterion you can use to evaluate your models, for example, even if you are not a modeling guy. So some visualization. And I think I almost finished, and I just added this because what is really interesting in Galaxy is that this is something with 20 years old, and I have a sustainability report we just published, who is really amazing. It is built by open source community. This is usable by anyone. You can use it, you can contribute it. And something which is really at the basis of Galaxy is transparency, accessibility, traceability, and reproducibility. And looking at that, we see that the talk from this morning from Sabina Leolini, speaking about, it's essential to track data provenance and data processing supporting knowledge. We are continuing creating a lot of tools to go very fast, but not very far. This is clearly the things we want to promote with Galaxy. Galaxy has a lot of defaults, but there's a really good things with Galaxy. It's open, it's there, you can use it without money, and you can have a particularly high level of accessibility, transparencies, and traceability and reproducibility of the process. In a collaborative environment, you can share tools and things like that. And I think I'm okay. I just want to finish to thank you all the young guys who are with me since 7 years, working on Galaxy Ecology, testing things. It's really something huge for me. So don't hesitate to go to ecology.usegalaxy.eu, test, visit, give me question, feedback, and contribute if you want, or test it, please.
Thank you. Great talk. And we have hit lunchtime, so please follow up if you didn't get a chance to ask a question from one of our speakers. And please join me in thanking everybody who spoke in this session. And don't forget to come back tomorrow after morning tea. Thanks.
Thank you.